Marta Nussbaum, profesora distinguida de Derecho y Ética de la Universidad de Chicago, Premio Kyoto por su trayectoria 2016, Premio Príncipe de Asturias de Ciencias Sociales 2012. Recibió su licenciatura en la Universidad de Nueva York y su maestría y doctorado en Harvard. Ha enseñado en las universidades de Harvard, Brown y Oxford. También es asociada en el Departamento de Clásicos, la Escuela de Teología y el Departamento de Ciencias Políticas de la Universidad de Chicago. Nussbaum es reconocida internacionalmente por su trabajo en la filosofía griega y romana antigua, filosofía feminista, filosofía política y las artes. Ha recibido numerosos premios y títulos honoríficos y es autora de diferentes libros y artículos, entre los que destacamos Crear capacidades, emociones políticas, sin fines de lucro, ¿por qué la democracia necesita de las humanidades?, entre otros.
Buenos días, profesora Nussbaum. Bienvenida a Colombia, bienvenida a Bogotá y a este foro de las cajas de compensación familiar, ASOCajas. Nosotros estamos realmente honrados con que haya aceptado nuestra invitación. Para nosotros es muy importante las humanidades, la filosofía, porque a través de las ciencias sociales se hacen mejores personas. Este es un momento difícil de incertidumbre, pero precisamente por eso es que la conciencia debe estar alerta, el pensamiento debe ser crítico ante esta avalancha de información y de incertidumbre. Es un momento en que las democracias son débiles, así que sus palabras para nosotros y su conferencia es de un gran valor. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos. Esperamos que todos ustedes disfruten esta conferencia. Y pues Marta, adelante, está en su casa, bienvenida otra vez. Estuvo usted con nosotros en el año 2016, así que bienvenida.
Well, thank you very much. And greetings to ASOCajas and to all my listeners in Colombia. I very much enjoyed my visit in 2016, which I'll say something about later. And I'm looking forward to visiting again in 2021. I'm going to start with a quotation from the great democratic educator John Dewey from his book, Democracy and Education. Achievement comes to denote the sort of thing that a well-planned machine can do better than a human being can. And the main effect of education, the achieving of a life of rich significance, falls by the wayside. So, part one, the silent crisis. We're in the midst of a crisis of massive proportions and grave global significance. And no, I'm not talking about the coronavirus pandemic. At least there, we all know that this is a terrible crisis and one that we must face. No, I mean a crisis that goes largely unnoticed, like a cancer, a crisis that's likely to be, in the long run, even more damaging to the future of democracy, a worldwide crisis in education. Radical changes are occurring in what democratic societies teach young people, and these changes have not been well thought through. Thirsty for national profit, nations and their systems of education are heedlessly discarding skills that are needed to keep democracies alive. If this trend continues, nations all over the world will soon be producing useful machines rather than complete democratic citizens who can think for themselves, criticize tradition, and understand the significance of another person's sufferings and achievements. The future of the world's democracies hangs in the balance. Well, what are these radical changes? The humanities and the arts are being cut away in both primary, secondary, and in university education in virtually every country in the world, seen by policymakers as useless frills at a time when nations must cut away all useless things in order to stay competitive in the global market. They are rapidly losing their place in curricula and also in the minds and hearts of parents and young people. Indeed, what we might call the humanistic aspect of science and social science, namely the imaginative, creative aspect and the aspect of rigorous critical thinking, are also losing ground as nations prefer to pursue short-term profit by the cultivation of useful, highly applied skills suited only to profit making. This crisis in my own nation and in many others is caused by a lack of reflection about what a democratic nation is and what it strives for. In this lecture, I will connect the education problem to a necessary shift in thinking from a paradigm that treats economic growth as the index of a nation's progress to a paradigm that focuses on human equality and on the ability of people to choose activities that they have reason to value, what I've long called human capabilities, abilities inherent in the very idea of a life worthy of human dignity. Nothing could be more crucial to democracy than the education of its citizens. Through primary and secondary education, young citizens form at a crucial age habits of mind that will be with them throughout their lives. They learn to ask questions or not to ask them, to take what they hear at face value or to probe more deeply, to imagine the situation of a person different from themselves, or just to see a new person as a mere threat to the success of their own projects, to think of themselves as members of a homogeneous group of members of a nation, or as members of a diverse nation and a world made up of many people and groups, all of whom deserve respect and understanding. The standard way of assessing the progress of a nation is economic growth, measured by gross domestic product per capita. That crude paradigm, of course, neglects distribution and can give high marks to nations like Colombia or the United States, where economic inequality is great and increasing. It also fails to recognize the fact that the quality and dignity of a human life is plural and not single. It requires focus on health, on political inclusion, on employment, in short, a long list of separate human capabilities. The growth paradigm suggests to many educators that science and technology are of the greatest importance for the future health of their nations. Now, we should have no objection to good education in these subjects, and I'm not suggesting that nations should cease to improve in that regard. Indeed, basic science, connected, oriented to truth and not just to profit, is an ally of the humanities in the struggle against education. But other abilities, equally crucial, are at risk of getting lost in the competitive flurry. Abilities crucial to the health of any democracy internally and to the creation of a decent world culture capable of constructively addressing the world's most pressing problems. If we focus instead on respect for the dignity of each citizen and on the cultivation of a wide range of capabilities, that is to say, substantial freedoms for choice of valuable activities, we will be led in the direction of a different set of abilities. These abilities are associated with the humanities and the arts. The ability to think critically, the ability to transcend local loyalties, and to approach world problems as a citizen of the whole world. And finally, and I think most important, the ability to imagine sympathetically the predicament of another person. If we don't cultivate these abilities, our democracies may be undermined from within in a process that the great Indian educator and philosopher Rabindranath Tagore called a gradual suicide by shrinkage of the soul. Part 2, education for freedom, 3 abilities. So 3 abilities are essential to the cultivation of democratic citizenship in today's world, especially in nations that are striving to overcome persisting inequalities and aspire to the greater empowerment of all citizens. I'll talk about schools here, but the topic is really much bigger than that, since these same values can and should be realized in public discussion and debate at all levels. When I turn to Colombia in the next section of my talk, I'll make this breadth clear. First, then, is the capacity for critical examination of oneself and one's own traditions, for living what, following Socrates, we might call the examined life. This means a life that accepts no belief as authoritative simply because it has been handed down by tradition or has become familiar through habit. A life that questions all beliefs, statements, and arguments, and accepts only those that survive reason's demand for consistency and for justification. Training this capacity requires developing the capacity to reason logically, to test what one reads or says for consistency, correctness of fact, and accuracy of judgment. And testing of this sort frequently produces challenges to tradition, as Socrates knew well when he defended himself and his own life against the charge that he was corrupting the young. But he defended his activity on the grounds that democracy needs citizens who can think for themselves rather than simply deferring to authority, who can reason together about their choices rather than just trading claims and counterclaims. He compared himself to a gadfly, a stinging fly on the back of the democracy, which he called a noble but sluggish horse. He was stinging the democracy to wake it up so that it could conduct its business in a more reflective and reasoned way. Modern democracies, like Socrates' Athens, but even more so given the nature of the modern media, are prone to hasty and sloppy reasoning and to the substitution of invective for real deliberation. We need Socratic teaching to fulfill the promise of democratic citizenship. Critical thinking is particularly important for good citizenship in a society that needs to come to grips with the presence of people who differ by ethnicity, caste, class, and religion, and in which group membership leads to unequal life chances. We'll only have a chance at adequate dialogue across cultural boundaries if young citizens know how to conduct a dialogue and a deliberation in the first place. And they will only know how to do that if they first learn how to examine themselves and to think about the reasons why they are inclined to support one thing rather than another, rather than, as so often happens, seeing political debate as simply a way of boasting or getting an advantage for their own group. When politicians bring simplistic propaganda their way, as politicians in every country have a way of doing, young people will only have a hope of preserving independence if they know how to think critically about what they hear, testing its logic and its concepts, and imagining alternatives to it. Students exposed to instruction in critical thinking learn at the same time a new attitude to those who disagree with them. In our polarized societies, young people often grow up seeing a dispute as like a wrestling match with winners and losers, where the aim is to defeat and maybe even to humiliate the other side. But a good class in Socratic argument will ask students to reconstruct the arguments for positions that they actually don't agree with, learning in the process that the other side does in fact have arguments and that the two sides may even share some important beliefs. This transformation is precisely what Socrates and indeed Dewey and Rabindranath Tagore had in mind. The idea that one will take responsibility for one's own reasoning and exchange ideas with others in an atmosphere of mutual respect for reason is essential to the peaceful resolution of differences, both within a nation and in a world increasingly polarized by ethnic and religious conflict. It's possible, and I think essential, to encourage critical thinking from the very beginning of a child's education, but it can gradually take a more mature form, for example, in the liberal arts portion of an undergraduate university education, through required courses in philosophy aimed at people who are not seeking to become professional philosophers, but rather to lead the Socratic examined life as democratic citizens. But now to the second part of my proposal. Citizens who cultivate their capacity for effective democratic citizenship need further an ability to see themselves as not simply citizens of some local region or group, but also and above all, as human beings bound to all other human beings through ties of recognition and concern. They have to understand both the differences that make understanding difficult and yet the shared human needs and interests that make understanding essential if shared problems are to be solved. This means learning quite a lot, both about nations other than one's own and about the different groups that are part of one's own nation. In the absence of a good grounding for international cooperation in the schools and universities of the world, however, our human interactions are likely to be mediated by the very thin norms of market exchange, where all human lives are seen as instruments for gain. The world's schools, colleges, and universities, therefore, have a big and urgent task to cultivate in students the ability to see themselves as members of a diverse nation, for all modern nations are highly heterogeneous, and a still more heterogeneous world, understanding something of the history and character of the diverse groups that inhabit it. This aspect of education requires a lot of factual knowledge that students who grew up even 30 years ago almost never got, at least in my own nation. Knowledge about the various subgroups, ethnic, national, religious, class, and gender-based, that comprise one's own nation, their achievements, their struggles, and their contributions, and similarly complex knowledge about nations and traditions outside one's own. We always taught young people about little parts of the world, but until very recently, never tried to cover the major nations and regions in any systematic way, treating all regions as significant. Knowledge is no guarantee of good behavior, but ignorance is a virtual guarantee of bad behavior. Simple cultural and religious stereotypes abound in our world. For example, the facile equation of Islam with terrorism. The first way to begin combating these is to make sure that from a very early age, students learn a different relation to the world, mediated by correct facts and respectful curiosity. Young people should gradually come to understand both the differences that make understanding difficult between groups and nations, and the shared human needs and interests that make understanding essential if common problems are to be solved. The task of teaching intelligent world citizenship seems so vast that it's tempting to just throw up one's hands and say it cannot be done, so we better stick with our own nation. Even understanding our own nation, of course, requires a study of its component groups, and this was rarely done in most nations in previous eras. It also requires understanding immigration and its history, and that study leads the mind naturally to the problems elsewhere that give rise to the need to migrate. Nor should one grant that there is a way of understanding one's own nation and its history adequately without setting that history in a global context. All good historical understanding of one's own nation requires grounding in world history. Today, however, we need world history and global understanding for reasons that go beyond what is required to understand our own nation, the problems we face and the responsibilities we bear. For example, the responsibilities involved in thinking about climate change and global warming call on us to study the nations and cultures of the world in a more focused and systematic way. Think, for example, of what it takes to understand the origins of the products we use in our daily lives, our soft drinks, our clothing, our coffee, our food. In earlier eras, educators, in fact, like John Dewey, who focused on democratic citizenship, often educated by taking children through the complicated story of the labor that produced the products they use in their daily lives, as a lesson in the way their own nation had constructed its economy and its menu of jobs, rewards, and opportunities. That type of understanding of human labor and human inequality was and is important for citizenship, since it prompts awareness of and concern for the different class groups that make up a society, their different work conditions and living conditions. Today, however, any such story is necessarily a world story. You can't even understand where a simple soft drink comes from without thinking about lives in other nations. And when we do, it makes sense to think about the living conditions of those people, their education, and their labor relations. And when we ask such questions, we need to think about our own responsibilities to those people as agents and consumers, and therefore agents in the creation of their daily circumstances. How has the international network of which we consumers are a crucial part shaped their labor conditions? What opportunities do they actually have? Should we agree to be part of the causal network that produces their situation, or should we demand changes? How might we promote a decent living standard for those outside our borders who produce what we need, just as we usually feel ourselves committed to doing or try to do for workers within our own borders? To think about these questions well, young people need to understand how the global economy works. They also need to understand the history of such arrangements, for example, the role of colonialism in the past, of foreign investment and multinational corporations in the present, so that they see how arrangements that in many cases were not chosen by the local inhabitants determine their life opportunities. Equally crucial to the success of democracies in our world is the understanding of the world's many religious traditions. There's no area, except perhaps sexuality, where people are more likely to form demeaning stereotypes of the other that impede mutual respect and productive discussion. Children are naturally curious about the rituals, ceremonies, and celebrations of other nations and religions, so it's a good idea to capitalize on that curiosity early, presenting stories of the world's varied traditions in an age-appropriate form, asking children from different backgrounds to describe their own beliefs and practices, and in general, to create in the classroom a sense of global curiosity and respect. Children, for example, in my own nation could just as well hear a Hindu or Buddhist story sometimes, not always a classic Euro-American story expressing American religious values. In fact, actually, Hinduism and Buddhism are the two most rapidly growing religions in the United States. So exposure of this sort will foster not just better global citizenship, but better US citizenship as well. Curricula should be carefully planned from an early age to impart an ever more nuanced and richer knowledge of the world, its histories and cultures. Still more delicate and perhaps even more urgent is the task of understanding differences internal to one's own nation. An adequate education for living in a pluralistic democracy must be a multicultural education, by which I mean one that acquaints students with fundamentals about the histories and cultures of the many different groups with whom they share laws and institutions. These must include religious, ethnic, class, and gender-based groups. Language learning, history, economics, and political science all play a role in pursuing this understanding in different ways and at different levels. Awareness of the history of the cultural, economic, religious, and class-based differences is essential in order to promote the respect for another that is the essential underpinning for democratic dialogue. There's no easier source of disdain and neglect than ignorance and the sense of the inevitable naturalness of one's own way. In curricular terms, the crucial subjects here are history and political science, and at the university level, a study of the global economy, study of foreign languages, which of course we're dealing with here in this exchange, combined often with more specialized courses in one or more previously unfamiliar part of the world, will give students skills of comparison and greater cultural breadth, and will also give them skills to go on learning more. And here I do think the study of a foreign language plays a very valuable role, and I really apologize that Spanish is not one of the languages I know. I actually do know some other languages, but unfortunately not Spanish. When you do speak a foreign language, you begin to see how the world looks through the eyes of people different from yourself. And what you see is that things are carved up differently. There's no perfect translation, nothing but a kind of halting interpretation. And this offers essential lessons in cultural humility. Now, this brings me to the third and I think most important part of my proposal. Citizens can't think well on the basis of factual knowledge alone. The third ability of the citizen, closely related to the first two, is what I would call the narrative imagination. This means the ability to think what it would actually be like to be in the situation of a person different from oneself, and to understand the emotions, wishes, and needs that this person might have. As Rabindranath Tagore wrote, we may become powerful by knowledge, but we attain fullness by sympathy. But, he continues, we find that this education of sympathy is not only systematically ignored in schools, but is severely repressed. The narrative imagination is cultivated above all by literature and the arts. Reliance on the arts was the most revolutionary aspect of Tagore's and also John Dewey's educational proposals, which use theater, dance, music, and literature to cultivate the imagination. Through the imagination, we may attain a kind of insight into the experience of another that's very difficult to attain in daily life, particularly when our world has constructed sharp separations and also suspicions that make any encounter difficult. And we also learn what we do not know and how difficult any understanding of another human being is, including, and I think it's very important to include this, one's own understanding of oneself. The arts and humanities complement one another. In a traditional classroom, students study the texts of world literature, art, and music, but then they should have, in addition, opportunities to explore these works or to create new works of their own further through performance. The arts offer children opportunities for learning through their own creative activity, something that Dewey particularly emphasized. To put on a play about a social problem is to learn about it in a way that's likely to seem more meaningful to a child than the reading of a textbook account. Learning about hardship and discrimination, for example, enters the personality at a deeper level. The arts are also crucial sources of freedom and community. When people put on a play together or dance together, sing together, they have to learn to go beyond tradition and authority if they're going to express themselves well. And the sort of community created by the arts is typically non-hierarchical, a valuable model of a democratic community. Finally, the arts are great sources of joy, and this joy carries over into the rest of a child's education. The mother of my longtime collaborator, Nobel Prize-winning economist Amartya Sen, was a student, as indeed Amartya was later, in Rabindranath Tagore's school. And she wrote a wonderful book about Tagore as a dance teacher and a choreographer, which was suitably entitled Joy in All Work. This book shows how all the regular education in Tagore's school in Shantiniketan, which enabled these students to do very well in standard examinations, was infused with delight because of the way in which it was combined with dance and music. Children don't like to sit still all day, but they also don't know automatically how to express emotions with their bodies in dance. Tagore's expressive but also highly disciplined dance vocabulary was an essential source of creativity, of thought, and freedom for all pupils. But particularly in this case, as Amita Sen's book emphasizes, for women whose bodies had been taught to be full of shame and inexpressive. And there's a further point to be made about what arts do for the spectator. As Tagore knew, and as radical artists have often emphasized, the arts, by generating pleasure in connection with acts of subversion and cultural criticism, produce an endurable and even attractive dialogue with the prejudices of the past, rather than one fraught with fear and defensiveness. The great African-American writer Ralph Ellison, for example, called his novel, which the title of which is Invisible Man, he called it a raft of perception, entertainment, and hope that, he said, could help the American democracy negotiate the snags and whirlpools that stand between it and the democratic idea. Now, this image of the raft is taken from Mark Twain's novel Huckleberry Finn, where Huck Finn, who's white, and Jim, who is black, have a very subversive adventure traveling together down the Mississippi River on a raft. And the fun they have together leads to friendship. And that friendship ultimately leads Huck to discard the beliefs about racial hierarchy on which he was raised. Entertainment and fun are crucial to the ability of the arts to offer perception and hope. Ellison's novel announced its aim at the outset. It was to work on what he called the inner eyes of the reader. So the African-American narrator begins the novel by telling us he is invisible to the white society around him. But, he says, this invisibility is not the result of, quote, a chemical accident to my epidermis, end quote. Rather, it results from, quote, a certain deficiency of the inner eyes, end quote, of his readers' members. Those eyes, he says, that look out at the world through people's physical eyes. The surreal humor and the linguistic virtuosity of Ellison's novel are crucial to its attempt to woo and thus to change, ultimately, the inner eyes of the reader. At the heart of all three of the capacities that I've investigated is the idea of freedom. The freedom of the child's mind to engage critically with tradition, the freedom to imagine citizenship in both national and world terms, and to negotiate multiple allegiances with knowledge and confidence, the freedom to reach out in imagination, allowing another person's experience to enter oneself. Many politicians the world over don't like educational freedom. They seek to imprison children within a single correct ideology. It is only the dangerous idea of critical and imaginative freedom that offers democracies lasting strength as they face an uncertain future. Section 3, the 3 abilities in Colombia today. The capabilities approach has a great deal to offer Colombia as a diagnostic tool and as a roadmap for improvement. When I visited in 2016, I discussed the capabilities approach with the mayor of Medellin while visiting a new housing product that was just opening up outside the city, designed to give deprived citizens property rights, education, and access to employment. It was also a place of great joy and communal hope, all part of the capabilities approach's emphasis on affiliation and on the creative use of leisure. Now, I was asked by the mayor to speak about the approach, but I said, and I felt, although eventually I did have to say something, I felt that much of what it stood for was actually already there in this new project. And when later in my visit, I shared the stage with Sergio Fajardo, discussing the reconciliation process and the emotions of citizenship in a time of attempted reconciliation in front of an audience of 350 eager people with wonderful questions, I also felt deeply encouraged and impressed about the process that was taking place and about the quality of leadership really in the nation. Now, I think today, however, as I am aware, the nation has entered a period of great doubt and uncertainty. I do believe that the capabilities approach as a whole has much to offer in this period, but let me turn more specifically to education, which I think can be realized in schools, in universities, but also in public discussion among adult citizens in many different fora and media that should be organized to bring people together to debate the nation's future. Socratic reasoning is always valuable in democracies, but never more than when people are anxious and uncertain. For then they tend, and I see this every day in my country, they tend to become polarized and to substitute rhetoric for real argument. This is very much the situation of the US today, so all of us who care about civil and respectful argument are struggling to keep it going and to impart these norms to our students who are also increasingly polarized. In Colombia too, polarization must not be permitted to corrupt political discourse. Occasions for respectful deliberation and public debate can be organized in many different ways, much like, for example, my conversation with Sergio Fajardo and that audience, which was set up by the Universidad de Antioquia and Parque Explora. World citizenship, too, is a critical value in all these discussions. Issues such as climate change and biodiversity affect us all and must be addressed cooperatively if any solution is going to be found. And understanding the workings of the global economy is essential for a relatively poor nation such as Colombia that's eager to move ahead in terms of economic development, but without neglecting human development. And that means without neglecting healthcare, the cultivation of citizenship, and other important values. But it's perhaps my third ability, the narrative imagination, that's most urgently needed in Colombia today, and I think in the United States today, a cultivation of the imagination of humanity that renders us capable of seeing one another not as units of a growth-based calculus and not as soldiers marching on two warring sides, but as full human beings, each with an inalienable dignity and each with a distinctive point of view on reality. Literature and the arts enrich the imagination and keep it flexible and mobile, and they are essential parts of a democratic conversation. both in schools and in the culture at large. As Ralph Ellison said, they offer a much needed cultivation of our inner eyes. Last section, democracy in the balance. So to what extent has education for freedom, as I described it, become a reality in the world today? Now, the influence of the radical ideas of Dewey and Tagore has been worldwide, and perhaps Dewey more than Tagore because he was an educational entrepreneur in a way that Tagore wasn't, and he trusted other people to realize his ideas in a way that Tagore did not. In every primary school in the US, and I think in so many nations who were aware of Dewey's influence and that of the related influence of Paulo Freire, one will see at least some of these ideas realized. As young children learn by doing rather than by rote learning, as they use drama and literature to probe difficult historical and global issues. NGOs all over the world use such ideas very creatively, knowing that their task is not to stuff their pupils with facts, but to produce minds that seek out learning on their own and criticize tradition. The fact that NGO education is purely voluntary, of course, makes them seek techniques that enliven curiosity. Still, in government schools and in a lot of post-secondary education, applied science and technology are increasingly seen as the prestige subjects. Not even basic science, with its emphasis on critical thinking, but only applied skills, easily converted into profit-making strategies. Applied science and technology are important, and nations are surely right to focus on the prosperity that they promise to bring. It would be disastrous, however, if the other parts of a liberal education were short-circuited in the process, producing nations of smart engineers who have little capacity for empathetic imagining and for critical thinking. Such impoverishment of mind would nourish a politics of obtuseness, polarization, and even hatred all over the world. Socratic education, emphasizing critical thinking and imaginative learning, exacts higher human costs than education that allows rote learning to dominate in history and the humanities. One can't teach my three abilities well with a pupil-teacher ratio of 50-1, which is common in the overburdened schools all over the world. But the importance of these abilities for the health of democracy is out of all proportion to these costs. Furthermore, both pupils and teachers come to school eager for the school day when the day is spent in lively interaction rather than rote learning. Thus, Socratic education holds out hope of stemming the tide of teacher and pupil absenteeism, a chronic problem in all developing nations, and of pupil boredom and indifference, which is a chronic problem in all nations. I do not believe that Socratic education works only in the presence of a charismatic leader like Tagore. The imagination is a pretty hardy plant. When it's not killed, it can thrive in many places and many different conditions, as I have seen it thrive in development projects all over the world, and certainly on my visit to Medellin, in that development project that I visited there. If NGOs that have no equipment and no money, only heart and mind and a few slates and some chalk or paint and paper can accomplish so much, there's no excuse for government schools the world over to lag behind. I can best summarize my wish for the future of education in today's world and in my country and in your country with a poem written by Tagore addressed to his country. He writes, "Where the mind is without fear and the head is held high, where knowledge is free, where the world has not been broken up into fragments by narrow domestic walls, where words come out from the depth of truth, where tireless striving stretches its arms toward perfection, where the clear stream of reason has not lost its way into the dreary desert sand of dead habit, where the mind is led forward by thee into ever-widening thought and action, into that heaven of freedom, my Father, let my country awake. So I will end there and thank you all for listening, but to say I'm very much looking forward to the next part, which will be a discussion.
Alejandro Gaviria Uribe, rector, Universidad de los Andes. Ingeniero civil, magíster en economía y doctor en economía. Cuenta con una amplia trayectoria como investigador, escritor y docente. Fue ministro de Salud y Protección Social, subdirector del Departamento Nacional de Planeación y Fedesarrollo, en donde también fue investigador. Ha sido consultor del Banco Mundial e investigador del Banco Interamericano de Desarrollo BID. Lideró durante 6 años la Facultad de Economía de los Andes como decano y se ha desempeñado como docente de la Universidad de los Andes, Universidad del Rosario, Pontificia Universidad Javeriana, Universidad Nacional de Colombia y la Universidad de California en San Diego. Ha realizado escritos y publicaciones académicas sobre el desarrollo, economía, políticas públicas, política antidroga y literatura, entre otros. Juan Carlos Henao Pérez, rector, Universidad Externado de Colombia. Abogado, especialista en Derecho Administrativo, magíster en Derecho Público y doctor en Derecho. Cuenta con una amplia trayectoria como profesor de Derecho Constitucional, Derecho Administrativo, Derecho de la Responsabilidad Civil y Conciliación. Como servidor público, su carrera había ascendido hasta la Corte Constitucional de Colombia, de la que fue magistrado y presidente. Se retiró de la Corte para aceptar en 2012 la rectoría de la Universidad Externado. Fue asesor del despacho del Procurador General de la Nación, Procurador Primero delegado ante el Consejo de Estado y magistrado auxiliar de la Sección Tercera del Consejo de Estado.
Muchas gracias, profesora Nussbaum, por la excelente presentación, por su defensa de la educación liberal, de la democracia deliberativa y del pluralismo. El doctor Juan Carlos Henao y yo somos rectores de 2 universidades colombianas comprometidas con la educación liberal, con el pensamiento crítico, con la diversidad y la imaginación compasiva, para utilizar tus palabras. Compartimos su preocupación por la crisis de las humanidades y la excesiva instrumentalización de la educación. Reconocemos muchas de las mismas amenazas, la preeminencia del mercado, la polarización e incluso cierta impaciencia y ansiedad de muchos jóvenes. Pero quiero preguntar por un aspecto diferente, una amenaza diferente que usted no mencionó de manera explícita en la presentación. Y es el antiliberalismo que se ha instalado en muchas universidades, la intolerancia. Si John Stuart Mill estuviera vivo, no podía creerlo. ¿Qué opina, por ejemplo, de la decisión que tomó la Universidad de Edimburgo de retirar el nombre de David Hume de una de sus construcciones? ¿Qué opina en últimas de la cultura de la cancelación, de esas tendencias intolerantes que hoy parecen, vuelvo y repito, a ser parte incluso de las universidades y la educación?
So I totally agree that this is a real danger. And in fact, I have a new book that's coming out about the Me Too movement and the role of cancel culture in that, which says just this. I think it's very difficult for young people to know where justified criticism ends and this kind of pernicious cancel culture begins. You know, there are some people we probably shouldn't be honoring in our society, and to name a building after somebody is indeed to honor them. And so I think no one would propose to keep a building standing named the Hitler building or something. So there are people who should not be honored. So I agree with the critique up to that point. But then the question is, you know, the past is full of bad behavior. And pretty much everyone, even 100 years ago, was against the equality of women, let's face it. And racism was everywhere. So we have to figure out how to draw the line. And I think this is very difficult, but we must do it by public deliberation and public debate. In my own nation, for example, I think it's absolutely appalling that Navy bases and Army bases are named after Confederate generals who fought for the defense of slavery, but they were also traitors. It's ridiculous to ask soldiers to serve on a base that's named after a traitor who was fighting against their own country. So I think that's, you know, that's an easy case, that the Fort Bragg should not be called Fort Bragg. But and then there are some other easy cases. I think the football, I'm a big sports fan, so I think the football team, the Washington Redskins, is right to drop that name. You know, it insults people and it's needless, and they can have a different name without any problem. I don't know what the particular objection to Hume was. Of course, Hume in his own day was controversial because he was an atheist. So in his own day, he was canceled also. He was denied a professorship. But I guess, you know, I think that's the case where the achievements outweigh by so much the difficulties that one might find with him. And so I think we have to have this difficult public discussion. And when we do, I think there has to be a sense of due process, listening, and sympathy. I don't like the way that people who are merely accused of sexual assault with no due process are canceled and, you know, have to resign their position. I think there has to be an element of due process and fairness in all of this discussion. And that is, I agree with you, that my students have a problem with that. They don't want to listen to the other side. And I think at our university, we emphasize listening and civil debate. But the trouble is our students come from other places. And even let's say the graduate students and the law students are often undergraduates in places where they're used to just having their way and canceling anyone they don't like. So it's getting more and more difficult. When I won a prize last year, I gave the money to set up a program of lunches where students with different views would meet for only 90 minutes, just a lunch, to talk across some nice food with two professors who also had different views, just to get the discussion of difficult issues started. And that, of course, it's very small. I mean, bringing 15 people together for lunch is not going to change the world, but it's the one place where one could start. And I think it does some good if you have that experience where a very difficult problem can be discussed calmly and civilly with the professors who have different views leading the way, that can spread. So I recommend that strategy because, I don't know, in my university, where people have a lot of choice in the classes they take, unfortunately, people don't take classes from me now unless they already think they agree with me. I used to teach people who were, you know, leading Republicans. They were in my feminist philosophy class. Now they just wouldn't take it because the Republican Party would say, oh, what's that course on that person's transcript? So I can't get them into my classes. Therefore, I have to have these social occasions. But I think you can all figure out what are the right modes in your universities to get people from different points of view working together and arguing together, and hopefully in the classroom too, but when they're not in the same class together, then in these other fora.
Muchas gracias, profesor Nussbaum, por la respuesta. De alguna manera me parece paradójico que yo, incluso como educador, tenga que tener un libro publicado en el año 1859 sobre la libertad de John Stuart Mill como algo que tenemos que repetir todos los días. Y un libro que incluso muchos años después, siglo y medio después, parece teniendo un mensaje esencial, subversivo incluso. Pero es sin duda un problema complejo que enfrentamos hoy en todas las instituciones de educación superior. Quiero darle la palabra entonces a mi colega Juan Carlos Henao para que formule la siguiente pregunta.
Profesora Nussbaum, es un verdadero placer. Déjeme, yo inicio con una palabra que es de su corazón. Estoy emocionado, muy emocionado de verla, de tenerla aquí en Colombia, que la quieren. Realmente sus palabras dan esperanza, estimulan, reconfortan, pacifican. Es un lenguaje, pues, 100% humanista que mucho le está haciendo falta al mundo. Yo quiero hacerle una pregunta y hago una muy pequeña introducción, pues usted, y no me voy a meter de filósofo porque no lo soy, pero comparto toda la filosofía que le acaba de decir mi colega Alejandro, de que somos dos universidades que estamos muy cercanos a su pensamiento, a su manera de concebir la educación. Y su obra de vida examinada, su concepto de vida examinada, que parte de Sócrates, como usted lo bien denuncia, donde muestra una humildad para comprometerse con una argumentación y con un debate serio. Ese concepto de vida examinada que supone también la voluntad de escuchar al otro, como se dice coloquialmente, de ponerse los zapatos del otro. ¿Sí? Esa filosofía suya de construir el yo democrático, que mate al bebé monárquico que todos tenemos cuando nacimos, con ese llanto que usted, cierto, dice que es un llanto monárquico y exigente. Todo esto, con lo cual estoy gratamente de acuerdo, y le quiero también recordar agradeciéndole su mensaje que dio, cito entre comillas, mensaje al pueblo colombiano que usted dio el 24 de agosto de 2016, cuando estábamos en la construcción del proceso de paz, del cual, entre otras, le comento que yo fui uno de los negociadores del texto de justicia transicional y tuve la oportunidad hermosa de generar ese diálogo con la gente de la antigua FARC-EP. Y en ese mensaje usted nos decía una frase muy linda. Por ejemplo, el espíritu de la revancha y la retribución es el veneno de cualquier relación humana. Cierro comillas. Por ejemplo, una política de la reconciliación debe ser una política de verdad y de justicia. Entonces, con esta introducción yo quiero hacerle una pregunta por algo que me preocupa y además habiendo visto en una entrevista suya que usted tiene, ha leído a Habermas, a Jürgen Habermas y toda la teoría de la comunicación que él ha desarrollado. Yo le quiero hacer esta pregunta concreta. La leo. ¿Cuándo un ser humano puede, si es que puede, cuando un ser humano puede, si es que puede, romper con la argumentación y el debate riguroso frente a la actitud de otros seres humanos? ¿Hay algún momento o situación en que se pueda perder la esperanza? Complemento la pregunta, profesora Nussbaum. La posibilidad de romper el diálogo, si es que existe, lo vuelvo a decir, si es que existe para usted, puede justificar el no perdón que estaría autorizado por las opciones éticas que permite la libertad de conciencia que usted tanto defiende.
First of all, I want to just say in return that I very much have loved all the dialogue that I've had with people in Colombia. I go to lots of different countries, but I don't think I've ever been in another country, and including the United States, where there's a more passionate interest in discussion, in dialogue, and where a kind of respect for philosophy infuses these public discussions. Of course, a small country has an easier time bringing people together sometimes than a big one. But I have to tell you, talking to the mayor of Medellin, talking to Sergio Fajardo, I have never met the mayor of my own city, even though she went to the University of Chicago. The only people in politics I know are people who were former students of mine, or maybe sometimes if I give some money to a candidate and throw a fundraiser for a candidate. But, we don't get to know people in the climate of public dialogue, or if we do, there's just no respect for philosophy. Intellectuals are objects of, I'm afraid, suspicion certainly by the right wing, but also to some extent, the Democrats, because they respect technical expertise, but not philosophy. So I really love my dialogue with Colombia, and I think you have a lot of resources to draw on in your current situation. I think, of course, hope is something that, as I say, at the end of the monarchy of fear, hope, you can't ask for a justification, because in any situation of uncertainty, there's reason for fear, maybe even despair, but there would be equally some reason for hope. And the difference between fear and hope is more or less a matter of personal will and personal choice. It's like the decision to look at this cup and see it as half full rather than half empty. And Immanuel Kant said that because we can't know whether there's anything that we have to hope for, we have a practical obligation as ethical beings to maintain hope in ourselves, because it's only that hope that could lead us to act well and energetically in public life. So I kind of believe that. I think everything's very uncertain. You could all say, oh, well, there's no reason for hope. And boy, I know plenty of people in my own country who've kind of dropped out of the future of the country. Partly the coronavirus makes it worse because people are, anyway, they're isolated. And so they can quickly get into these little pockets of despair and give up on hope or on dialogue with the other side. I find this in my own family, unfortunately. I just had a visit with some other parts of my family who are on the, as it were, other side politically. And, by being isolated, they had gotten more polarized. And being more polarized, they had kind of given up on talking to the other side. It was very difficult. So I think we have a moral obligation not to give up, but to persist in our efforts and to keep going, and not only keep talking to the people we like, but to keep trying to reach out and cultivate dialogue with the people who don't believe the same thing. And I think on any political side, there are going to be reasonable people who can be reached and issues that the two sides share. So I think we have a duty to keep going. And I think the coronavirus is one issue, which of course brings people together. It's got to. We all must be in this together. And anyone who says otherwise, including my president, is just foolish. Well, now we know, of course, now that he has the virus, now he knows it's real. So anyway, not that I wish him recovery, but I think at least he's learned something by contracting the virus. He knows it's not a myth. But anyway, I think we must not give up. It's not easy. But, I think the greatest hero one of my greatest heroes is Nelson Mandela. When you think of that life where he was so isolated and he was imprisoned for a total of 27 years under really disgraceful and awful conditions. I've been to that prison on Robben Island with not enough food, not enough clothing, horribly hard work to do, breaking up rocks in a quarry without even any eyeglasses to shield his eyes from the sun. And he would, if you read his prison letters, he was a man who never gave up hope. He wrote letters about small things. How could we make the prison conditions better for himself and for others? how might he get a pair of glasses? Just keeping going on these small projects, he kept himself in the world of hope. And of course, after many, many years, when most people would have given up, his hopes were realized. So I think we must learn from that and never, never give up, even though, of course, some of us will die before our hopes are realized, but we might sow the seeds of future hope for other people.
Muchas gracias, profesora Nussbaum. No sé, profesora, si usted conoce a un intelectual alemán, economista y filósofo, Albert O. Hirschman. Estuvo en Colombia en los años 50.
Yeah, the economist, yes. I knew him personally, yes. I mean, he was actually worked with Amartya Sen and me in founding these projects at the World Institute for Development Economics Research. He was a wonderful man, yeah. Yeah.
Y tiene una frase que yo hice mía y que me gusta repetir, y es la necesidad de un sesgo por la esperanza, a bias for hope. Y hoy lo necesitamos más que siempre. Y también enfatizó una y otra vez lo que yo podría llamar los bolsillos o resquicios de posibilismo. Cada uno desde nuestro ámbito, aportar para ir mejorando la situación, así la situación global desde arriba, vista panorámicamente, luzca desesperanzadora. Un sesgo por la esperanza. Y eso me da pie a la siguiente pregunta que quiero hacerle. Y tiene que ver con la audiencia, con quienes nos acompañan en esta conferencia. Y con la idea de que la educación tiene que ser para toda la vida, pero pensando sobre todo en los líderes empresariales, en la gente que está en el sector privado, en los directores de las cajas de compensación, en la gente que tiene hoy en ámbitos que no son necesariamente los de la vida pública, que están un poco por fuera. ¿Qué pueden hacer estas personas? ¿Qué puede hacer un líder empresarial para fortalecer la democracia deliberativa? La educación para la democracia no termina en las universidades, no termina en los colegios y escuelas públicos y privados. Tiene también un lugar muy importante en los ámbitos privados. ¿Qué podrían hacer las personas que nos están oyendo en este momento para contribuir a esa necesaria educación para la democracia, a ese cambio de las mentes, a ese pensamiento crítico?
Well, I think the continued education of working adults is one of the great and important things that we must all try to realize. And certainly some European countries like the Netherlands have done quite a lot to have systematic organization of public discussion for working adults. And I've been in some of these discussions. But, you know, in most countries, the business world and the professional world doesn't do enough to foster that. Now, I think one profession that has contributed quite a lot to fostering discussion is actually the medical world. In the last 30 years, there's been a tremendous difference in the way doctors get together. They have much more, in their education, they do much more discussion of ethical issues and clinical issues. They approach, even with literary texts, there's a whole medicine and literature program. But they also do, you know, periodically they have these discussions among themselves. And I see how it's infused now into the practice of doctors and the way they approach a case. I think it's very hard. I think that busy doctors, they're so busy that they hardly have time to think about anything. And nurses too, it's one of the hardest jobs in the world, being a nurse. But I do think that their progress has been made, first of all, by addressing professional education and making sure there's plenty of ethical discussion there, but then periodic sources of renewal, where a given team, for example, just take team working on kidney transplants, will get together as a team and have ethical discussions pertinent to what they're doing. Now, since I teach lawyers, of course, my own whole aim in being part of a law school is to infuse that kind of discussion into legal education. I think American legal education has done quite well because it's one of the few countries where law is a second degree rather than a first degree, so we can draw on the undergraduate education of our students to enrich their legal education. And it's much broader. So the fact that I'm teaching law students is something that wouldn't happen in most nations in Europe. And when we have LLM students who come from Latin America, they often comment on this. Oh, here we're talking to economists, philosophers, historians, and they try to bring that back to their own countries. And I think this is extremely important, that legal education in all countries would have this element of ethical, political, theoretical debate. And it was actually the chair that I hold is called the Ernst Freund Chair. Ernst Freund was a labor lawyer who was actually the first pioneer of administrative law in the United States. He was the one who created the plan for our law school. And he said, we're not just going to study law, we're going to study also philosophy and history and economics. So by now, all American law schools do that, but it wasn't automatic. I think that that's not enough, because when the students get out into the firms then need to keep that going. And I'm afraid that I don't think that law firms are doing as well as the medical profession in that regard. They're still profit machines. So when I teach feminist philosophy to law students, I know that all the things we're talking about the division of labor and the family and all of this stuff, the law firms don't want to hear anything about it. And if they're going to try to change the law firms, they first have to have an ear to listen. And everyone's so busy billing hours to their clients that they're not really having much of a discussion. Smaller firms are much better. And I have a lot of former students who leave the large firms in order to work in a smaller firm, just so they can have more discussion. But I really do think that larger law firms ought to take stock and think, law is not just about billing more and more hours. We have to have a climate of discussion. I've talked a lot in Finland, because that's where some of the work that Sen and I did on capabilities was done. And in Finland, the main law firm that represents Nokia does have a culture of philosophical discussion with all the young associates. So it's possible to do that and still be a successful law firm. In the business world, I think this is happening, I guess, more in the business world than in the law world in the United States. Certain firms like Apple, I think Apple has been a pioneer, because they see that success for them means cultivating the imagination. It means cultivating critical faculties. So they actually have philosophers working for them. My good friend, the excellent philosopher Joshua Cohen, works full-time for Apple now, and he talks to them about civic discourse and the civic environment and so forth. And he talks not just to the executives, but to the whole groups. And I think Google is another firm that has a lot of discussion. So, it's a case firm by firm. Some do better than others. But I do feel that that's crucial. And business education has become more ethical. I have former students who, philosophy PhDs who teach in business schools. So, yeah, I think it has to start in the business school, but then the corporation itself has to build in spaces for people to come together and have a real discussion. And this is, it's going to be hard to do, but there has to be a group of people committed to making that happen who will just keep insisting on it and insist on the fact that it doesn't mean giving up a time when you could make a profit. It actually makes people work better together in a spirit of respect. It helps the imagination generate new ideas. So I actually think it's a win-win situation. And I think the medical profession has shown that, because it's more ethical, but it's not worse. It's actually finding better solutions.
Muchas gracias. Yo soy economista, pero fui ministro de Salud de Colombia por 6 años y fui paciente de cáncer siendo ministro de Salud. Y puedo decir que aprendí más en ese lapso de las discusiones éticas de que en toda mi vida anterior. Mi contacto con los profesionales de la salud, con los médicos, me permitió, de alguna manera, voy a decirlo ahí, afinar o sofisticar mi visión ética del mundo, mi visión ética de las políticas públicas. Antes de darle la palabra a Juan Carlos, yo quisiera resaltar para nuestra audiencia colombiana un hecho que yo creo que es importante y que resalta la profesora Nussbaum sobre nuestro país. Y es la importancia que se le dan a las ideas, incluso a las ideas filosóficas en el debate de Colombia, cosa que muchas veces no reconocemos. La profesora Nussbaum, no quiero meterme en política, pero mencionó a Sergio Fajardo. Hoy en día la alcaldesa de Bogotá tiene un doctorado en ciencia política. Juan Carlos y yo hemos sido funcionarios públicos y hemos llevado las ideas filosóficas y este tipo de debates a todas partes. Entonces yo creo que eso es algo que no reconocemos, que en nuestro país muchas veces hay una discusión política sofisticada donde las ideas filosóficas tienen un lugar. Gracias, profesora Nussbaum, por recordarnos a veces algunas de las facetas positivas que tiene nuestro país.
I would just add one thing. You never know. It takes only one person to start up a critical culture. We have, of course, many powerful people who went to our law school, and one of them is Adam Silver, the commissioner of the National Basketball Association. And I've actually corresponded with him because I'm writing this book about sexual assault, about his attitudes about sports and sexual assault and so on. And he really is a philosophical thinker about this. And he's tried to think about how to get greater ethical responsibility to take root in the basketball world. And I think you can see now that the NBA is quite different from the NFL and other sports leagues. They listen about race, they listen about sex, and they have a kind of global consciousness through the many leagues they work with in the rest of the world. So, you know, I think Adam Silver and the previous commissioner was Stern, was very good too. It can be just one person who really insists on something and then makes it part of the culture.
La NBA también ha jugado un papel filantrópico muy importante ahora con el coronavirus, que todos hemos admirado un poco nosotros desde la distancia. Juan Carlos, si quieres, adelante.
Muchas gracias, Alejandro. Pues, profesora Nussbaum, cambio un poco de bando y me voy a una pregunta que tiene que ver con la literatura que usted tanto adora. Como mi querido Alejandro, el rector que usted tiene al frente, que ha sido ensayista en varias oportunidades y no solo economista. Y le quiero recordar, por si acaso lo conoce, o contarle algo que a mí me llama mucho la atención de nuestro fabuloso libro 100 años de soledad, de nuestro grandioso colombiano ya fallecido García Márquez. Y le voy a hacer el nexo con lo que usted dice de la literatura para formularle una pregunta. García Márquez cuenta en 100 años de soledad, y recorto porque ya los organizadores me están diciendo que no tenemos mucho tiempo. Él cuenta que cuando el cine llegó a Macondo, por primera vez, que nadie había visto cine, presentaron una película donde hubo varios muertos. Entonces, el pueblo que vio la película se fue por la noche e hizo unos entierros simbólicos, veló, lloró a los muertos. Ya el otro día vuelve otra vez a ver la película y ve a los mismos actores vivos. Entonces el pueblo se siente engañado, dice, y destruyen el teatro. Destruyen el teatro y dicen, no, pero si yo ayer lloré y ahora veo a esta gente. Y le tuvieron que explicar que el cine era una máquina de crear ilusiones, una frase muy hermosa de García Márquez, y terminan diciendo que optaron por no volver a ir al cine, considerando que ya tenían bastante con sus propias penas para llorar por fingidas desventuras de seres imaginarios. ¿Dónde voy con esta pregunta, profesora? Usted habla mucho de la literatura, sobre todo, por ejemplo, en su libro Poetic Justice, ¿cierto?, donde dice que la literatura es un elemento moral que nos exige interesarnos en personas extranjeras con vidas alejadas a las nuestras, que la literatura es subversiva lo repite en varias ocasiones, es subversiva porque modela la imaginación y los deseos de una manera que subvierte la norma racional de la ciencia y que nos muestra lo que podría ocurrirle a cualquier ser humano. Ese es el encanto que tiene la literatura y el cine. Por eso le traigo la citación de García Márquez, que produce emociones poderosas que pueden desconcertar y cuestionar. Este tema de la literatura, a todos los que están acá oyendo gracias a este congreso de Azocajas, al mismo que la filosofía, es fundamentalmente entrarlo en la cabeza y tratarlo de hacerlo lo más cotidiano posible. La pregunta es concreta con esta introducción. ¿Le parece que la corrección que exige una concepción decente de la política impide el vuelo de la imaginación y la subversión literaria? ¿Dónde se encuentra la relación entre la literatura subversiva y el discurso político incorrecto?
Yeah, I hope I understood this correctly. I think it's very complicated, but I think we have to be daring because literature isn't easily domesticated. And of course, some of the greatest works of the imagination were at first found extremely, so subversive that they were extremely shocking. And it's only in the long course of time that we see which works are going to steer us to good possibilities and which ones might not steer us so well. And I don't think every work of literature steers us in a good direction. There are shocking works of brutality in literature and so forth. But I think myself, and back to John Stuart Mill, I'm in favor of encountering works of literature and then having a critical dialogue after that, because otherwise we just don't investigate all our possibilities. We have in our law school a law and literature program where we've had a series of 6 conferences now. Each one has become a book. The newest book, which will come out this year, is called War in Law and Literature. And, I think it supplies an element of kind of bodily reality. The experience of war is bodily, and war does its damage by tearing into the human body. But judges and lawyers often forget that. They can become very detached, very intellectualistic. And so they need to make contact, and I would say not only with literature, but also music. In fact, my essay in this book is about Benjamin Britten's War Requiem. Works that, deal with the body and realize in some measure with the way the words make sounds that clash and bang, and so the brutality of war. And sometimes that is very shocking. It may turn out to be shocking in a good way. It may turn out to be shocking in an effective way. But we first have to experience the work and then have a critical dialogue. And usually works that are bad, bad for us ethically, turn out, I think, also to be deficient artistically, because the badness is a kind of obtuseness and a closeness to the fullness of a human personality. So if we are lovers of literature, we'll learn to make that distinction, and we'll see which are the works that impoverish us and which are the ones that enrich us. I love your question, and I think it's a very hard one to think about. And I want to say that I think it's important to maintain the critical relation to the work. I actually am very critical of Benjamin Britten's stance because he was a total pacifist. He was a pacifist about World War II. He refused even civil service, supported civil service in World War II. So what am I supposed to think of this war requiem written by a person who would have been just, for all he was concerned, the Nazis might as well have taken over Europe? Well, I'm very critical of him, but on the other hand, I feel engaging with the work, in the end, I decided that the part I object to was not going to invalidate the work and the claims made by the work. But, you have to think through all these things, and everything is complicated that way, I'm afraid.
Yo creo, profesora Nussbaum, que tenemos que terminar esta sección aquí. Yo quiero agradecer personalmente, y por Juan Carlos, y por todos, primero que nos hayas enseñado hoy, nos hayas recordado que el optimismo es una responsabilidad moral de todos en este momento del mundo, en esta coyuntura, en estas circunstancias, que nos haya renovado la fe en la educación, no solamente como forma de resistencia, sino también para transformar el mundo. Y sobre todo, yo creo que este es el mensaje más importante y el que yo quisiera enfatizar, que nos hayas enseñado a que la democracia está en las mentes y que tenemos que respetar moralmente a nuestros adversarios, a quienes piensan distinto y a quienes son distintos. Y que así poco a poco, cada uno de nuestros ámbitos, podemos ir construyendo sociedades un poco más justas, un poco más decentes y un poco más dignas. Es un privilegio, es un honor para nosotros y para nuestro país contar con tus enseñanzas en este momento, en esta coyuntura, donde nos jugamos tanto. Un abrazo fuerte de todo corazón.
Well, I want to thank you for these wonderful remarks and questions. I feel very lucky to have had this chance to exchange ideas with you, and hope to meet you face to face on my next trip to Colombia.
Así será.
Sería un placer, profesora Nussbaum. Muchas gracias. A lo que dijo Alejandro de que la democracia está también en la cabeza, yo agrego, y también en las emociones.
In the heart.
Exacto.
In the heart.
Muchas gracias, profesora.
In the heart, also in the heart, yeah. So thank you very much, Professor Nussbaum. Was a great pleasure.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. We really appreciate it.
Great privilege to do this.
And your message is going to resound in our country. This is a difficult time for your country, for our country. But we will continue trying.
Yep.
Conference by conference, book by book, paper by paper, we will change the world.